I am Blaine Ashley. I'm the founder of New York Champagne Week and the Fizz is Female. New York Champagne Week launched in 2013, and I launched the Fizz is Female, which celebrates female-made, owned, and heavily led, now think CFO, CMO, CEO, made bubbly wine from around the world. And tonight I have the pleasure of introducing a rock star panel of women in the sustainable wine field. We're going to introduce them one by one, speak to them one by one, and then save your questions until the very end. Otherwise, we'll get nowhere. We won't have time to taste all the amazing wines these women brought to the table tonight. So I will start with Jenny Lefcourt. Jenny is the founder of Jenny and Francois, founder, co-owner, and president, or owner now, yes, and president of Jenny Francois, which is a wine importing company focused on natural wine sustainability, celebrating their 20th anniversary this spring, which is really amazing. Congratulations. Many have said that if you're drinking natural wine, it's because of Jenny Lefcourt. So that's all you need to know. And I messaged her the day her New York Times piece came out, and I didn't even know it until after I messaged her on Instagram, which was amazing. And she got back to me right away. So that just says a lot. Next, we have Mika Bulmash. Mika is the founder of Wine for the World. Wine for the World is a company that connects sustainability with your business model is amazing, but it's a natural or a sustainable wine importing company that you launched 7 years ago, and you come from a completely different space. So we will dive into that a little bit more later on. Next, we have Francis Gonzalez, the founder of veganwines.com. and also Despacito Distributors. So Francis has made a niche out of promoting vegan wine. So we will get to that in a little bit. And last, but certainly not least, we have my friends. These ladies are also friends, but they're new friends. But this is a friend I've had for a while. Alexis Percival, who is a partner, one of 4 partners, the only female partner of Ruffian Wine Bar, which is 100% sustainable. 100? You didn't start as 100, but I think now you're, if not 100, very close to 100% sustainable wine program. And they most recently launched their second endeavor called Kindred. So now we will go into some Q&A. Amazing, right? We are so lucky. All of these women are incredibly busy, so I know Alexis enough to know that when she came here, she was like, it was really hard for me to leave the restaurant. And here I am. So first we'll start with Jenny. Jenny, how did you even get into this space? I mean, you have an undergraduate from Cornell, you have a PhD in French literature and cinema from Harvard. You're a native New Yorker. Like, how did you get into wine?
So maybe I'll stand up because I have a little voice. So I started my company, Jenny and Francois Selections, 20 years ago. This spring, we're going to have a big party, so everyone should sign up for our newsletter. And absolutely. We'll have winemakers in town. We plan to have a good time. So 20 years ago, I went to France. I was studying to be a professor. I thought I would teach and do research, and I was hiding out in the libraries of Paris and then tasting wine at wine bars, in Paris. I was in Paris. So I thought I happened upon, through friends, through crazy circumstances, some wines that really spoke to me. And I didn't know much about wine at the time, but they seemed different. They seemed alive. They looked different. They were cloudy. They weren't clear. And I thought, if this is actually wine, then I really love wine and I need to know more about it. And so I started going to wine tastings and talking to winemakers and asking them, how do you make this? Like, what are you doing? And so all the winemakers had one thing in common, which was that they were growing their grapes organically or biodynamically. And then in their wine making, they weren't using any of the 300 additives that are permissible in winemaking, which are not listed on your label, which is scandalous and is still the truth. And so I realized that those were the wines that really spoke to me, that were alive, that were generous, that were just aromatically complex. And I brought them back in my suitcase to New York, and I realized that they weren't here, and that my friends didn't know about them, and that I had to introduce them to everyone I knew. And so that became my mission, and here I am 20 years later with a business that's a national business, and the natural wine world that's really exploded.
So being a pioneer in the space, how did you initially promote and market these wines that no one had ever heard of?
Yeah. I think initially it was a very different wine world. There were way less retailers, even in New York City. It was kind of sons of Italian immigrants who had the stores that had been around for a while. And there weren't all these smaller shops, women-owned shops. All of that didn't exist. And so there's been a real revolution in terms of retail, in terms of restaurants, in terms of the wine world in general. But at the time, I went to see these kinds of mainstays of New York retail with my little bag of wine, and I said, will you taste these wines? And, they would taste a few and say, wait a minute, this reminds me why I do what I do. There's something to these wines. Can you send me some cases? And I'd be like, I'll send you cases in 2 months if you give me a big order. and so I had to build up from nothing, really. I had no investors, no money, and I was, going back and forth with wine in my suitcase, and that's kind of how it happened. But it was a very different wine world at the time. And people weren't so interested in asking, how is a wine made? They didn't want to hear about sulfites and yeasts and all the things that I wanted to tell them about. So it's been a slow process of, people becoming more educated. That's been a big part of my journey, is trying to educate people about how wine is made, where it comes from, what goes into it, and the choices that winemakers make, and that they're expressing a place, a time, a vintage, something about the history of where they come from, which is hugely important.
To your point about people caring about where their wine is coming from and what's in their glass. So in your 20-year journey, I'm sure, and especially unless if you like wine and you're not living under a rock, you know that natural wine and sustainable wine has become a huge, huge thing in the last 4 or 5 years. So to your point, now that people actually care about more, or expressing that they care more about where their wine is coming from and how it's made, how has your company then been able to evolve as a result in the last 20 years?
So originally we were a 100% French company, just because I lived in France and loved France, and that's where I fell in love with wine. And that's also where this natural wine movement started. That's where really people came together and exchanged information about winemaking. And so the movement grew from there, and sort of my love of wine started there and then branched outward. And it really expanded to become a European movement, first Italy, then other countries, and now a world movement. And so it's incredible. The world of wine has changed dramatically in the last 20 years, and which is great because it means more growers are working organically or biodynamically, which basically means they're not putting chemicals in the soil that stay there forever. Like wineries in France is the biggest polluter in all of France is wine. So we have a romantic vision of what wine is, but the reality behind most wine is is something very different than we imagine when we see beautiful pictures of wineries.
So as like the OG of this space, where are you now in terms of how many wines you have in your portfolio? Like how many states you distribute to? Like where are we now 20 years later?
So I went from, living out of my suitcase, basically sleeping in my car and running my business out of my studio apartment to having a big company with, I think we're 11 people, and then we're in pretty much every state across the U.S. So we're a big company now. We've grown a lot, and especially the past 5 years, I'd say, because the interest in natural wine has exploded. And so, we're just growing a mile a minute. It's very exciting times for us.
Well, congratulations. We will get to Q&A again at the end, so we'll just move on to Mika. Mika, you are super impressive as well. I have to read it because it's like I've been trying to commit it to memory and I can't. You came from a career in international development with a focus on public health, agriculture, and food security programs. Tell us how you made the foray into the wine world. The agriculture makes a little sense. Okay.
So my path was a bit circuitous. As Blaine was mentioning, I came from an international development background, and my love of wine started in college, actually, when I was old enough to drink. I was a stone's throw from Napa Valley, so I would go on the weekends, and I would slowly fall in love with wine. And I was studying molecular and cell biology, so the nerd in me was really excited about how wine was made. And for a second, I thought about even becoming a winemaker. But I am a bit of a hippie at heart, and so I couldn't really reconcile being a winemaker with my other dream, which is was and still is, to make the world a slightly better place. So I went into international development, all the meanwhile nursing this passion for wine that I had. And I was working mostly out of DC in Latin America on Latin American projects. And there was a project that kind of came my way that I started managing, which was a Bolivian project to basically improve market access for poverty alleviation among agricultural commodities. So think quinoa, fruit, vegetables, that kind of thing. And it dawned on me that maybe there is a way to marry this love of mine for the wine industry and international development. So I had my kind of aha moment when I was sitting with my then boss in Guatemala, and we were working on this program for public health, and she asked where I saw myself in 20 years. And so to rewind a second, I was working on a number of programs at the same time, so public health and agriculture. And so I said, I want to do something in the wine industry. And she said, well, there's no better time than now. And she was right. So I went to South Africa, specifically looking for winemaking in the post-apartheid environment. Who was making wine? How it was being made? Was there anything related to development happening in the wine industry? And I met Ntsiki Biela, who is South Africa's first Black woman winemaker, among a lot of other winemakers as well. And I fell in love with her story, her wines. And it became really clear to me the more that I spent time there and the more I learned about the wine industry and the more I thought about what kind of wines I wanted to work with and how, that first and foremost, you have to start with quality in order to make any kind of movement into what is now a pretty congested industry. And also, for me and for the wines that I work with, wines that are socially or environmentally responsible, wines that are, to the greatest extent, minimal intervention, wines that have one of our wineries has a zero carbon footprint. One of our other wineries was named Ethical Company of the Year globally. So wines that have a bit of a message that also are great to drink, right, and fun to drink, and we want to lift everyone up, and so that's been my goal for the last 7 years, doing that through wine.
How did you initially source and curate your wines in your company's portfolio? being that you weren't so much like, Jenny was in France, you did part of your dissertation in France. So, like, how did you kind of start the ball rolling?
So in 2011, I did a harvest in South Africa. And so I was there for several months. And that's when I met Nitsiki and did kind of this research. And it was, if you will, it was kind of my excuse to not go to grad school because I had gotten into a program and I deferred. And so I was like, I'm going to create my own program. So I was really learning about it and digging in and doing a lot of self-study. And I came up with this idea while I was there, which was I didn't quite think I wanted to be an importer, and yet here I am, I'm an importer and distributor. But I had initially this idea to create a collaborative brand. And so that's what I started out with, was the idea was to make basically barriers to entry smaller by elevating and kind of democratizing wine in a way. And the way that I did that was through a collaboration between Nitsiki Biela, this amazing woman that I mentioned, and Helen Keplinger from Napa Valley, who's a well-known winemaker. She's been on Wine Spectator a number of times. She's just an amazing woman. Along the way, by the way, I have this common thread where I, as much as I can, try to support women and people of color. Again, this theme of trying to lift everybody up and be representative of who we are as drinkers as well. And so this collaborative brand we launched, I launched it with a crowdfunding campaign on Indiegogo, and then that turned into a business, and that business turned into an import business, and we still do the collaborative brand as much as we can. It's a lot harder to build a brand than I think it is to build an import company, but we'll see about that, if that changes.
I guess my last question to you for now would be, being that you're 7 years young, and you kind of came in right on the cusp of the big boom of natural and sustainable wine. What's next for you coming in that position? Like, how are you going? What's the next step? And I know that's an annoying question sometimes, but I have to ask it occasionally.
So we currently import and distribute wines from South Africa, Brazil. So the bubbles that you guys tried, there's a good chance there were 2 bubbles that were being served when you walked in. Some of the bubbles were from Brazil, and those are wines that I work with, as well as Greece and Spain. So we are looking at a couple of, and I know we're going to talk about the tariffs in a bit, but we're getting there. So what's next for us is kind of accelerating some of the paths that we were already looking at in some of the countries. So more in the Southern Hemisphere, more in South America, looking domestically as well. If it's from a weird region, I'm probably going to like it. But weird as in that we aren't familiar with it yet, not because it doesn't have a wine culture or it doesn't already produce fantastic wine. So that's part of the fun is identifying these obscure, kind of, in some cases, long shot regions. And just like you guys invest on diverse portfolios, so we as business people invest our resources and time and energy on producers that sometimes pan out really well and sometimes may not. And so there's a lot of parallels, I guess.
Thank you very much for being here tonight. Next, we have Francis Gonzalez, founder and owner of veganwines.com and Despacito Distribution. Now, Despacito focuses on plant-based wines, and veganwines.com is a direct-to-consumer shipping company. Obviously .com. And so what made you hone in on this particular vegan niche?
Well, I've been a vegan for over 25 years, and I was on a vacation in France, and I found out that not all wines are just grapes and sulfites. So it it took me by surprise, and my vacation turned into research. And my fiance would go in the car and drive, and I would go to almost every vineyard, every winery. And the more I learned, the more it got me more curious, because I was upset that now, you know, there was things inside wines that I love so much, and I was like, oh my gosh, don't tell me I got to give up wine. Then I came back to the U.S. and I said, we gotta know what vegan wines is. And I searched it and nothing. I couldn't find anything. Then I went to and did veganwines.com, and it was available. I was like, all right. Now, I've been a vegan for over 25 years. I know I love wine. I've never even thought I would be in the wine industry. But I felt like if I didn't get to this, somebody else would, and would do it the wrong way. And so I said, okay. So I just started it. I just said, I'm going to do it. And I did. And then my then lawyer said, well, why don't you become an importer and distributor? I'm like, okay, I don't know anything about it, but I'm going to do it. So the more what I said to myself, okay, I'm going to go to the vineyards, because that's the only way that I'm going to learn. And that's what I've been doing. So my rule is that I have to visit every vineyard, and that was out of the question that you asked me, but
You're giving us questions as we go,
so it was at the same time, like, the more I went in, no, it's okay. Then in California, the more I would go into wine tasting rooms and ask about vegan wines, and they'll look at me like really weird. And the more they looked at me weird, I'm like, I'm in for it even more. And because it wasn't out there. But I know people, like, even if you're not vegan, I mean, just the things that you hear that and you learn that's in the wines, it's like, you know, so that's what bought veganwines.com. And then I enjoy going to the vineyards and sourcing out wines. Why not? And that's where everything else came from, too, the Despacito.
Well, so she kind of touched on all my questions in her answer. So I guess what I ask next then is, you curate the wines on veganwines.com based off of your visits to vineyards, and that's how you curate the wines and pick your wine selections. How does the club work for people that might be interested in joining? That's a good question, since you just...
I know, sorry. So, California, okay, so we ship to over 40 states. We pair each wine, so it's every quarter, and we pair each wine with a recipe, a plant-based recipe, because one of the things that I want to see is like more people enjoying the food and wine pairing in the plant-based food, because a lot of times you go to vegan restaurants and they have the slightest clue on what the wine menu is, and it's very upsetting. So we do it quarterly, and we pair each one with the recipe, and now we're doing the story too, so everybody gets to know the story of the winemaker and our visit to there. We want to just make it feel like you were there with us. So that's the wine club. You sign up. There's no fees. You just sign up and you can cancel whenever. We just want you to give us a try, and we ship out 3 times a year, 6 bottles of wines.
And tonight, the wines that you brought for the tasting following the panel, you have the winemaker Luca here for, so that's kind of cool. Okay, so next we have Alexis. If you've been to Ruffian or Kindred, which is their most recently opened spot, they're great. Also pioneers to a degree, I feel, of almost 100% natural wine focused bar. Tell us just about how the concept came to life with you and your 4 partners, 3 of which are male. Not that this is about, again, I had a dude earlier say, you need to focus more on the fact that they're female. I think we all know they're female, so let's talk about, but how did you find your partners, and how did the concept come to life? Oh, yeah.
Hi. Well, so if anybody needs any background on why Blaine was hesitating to say, is that 100% sustainable or natural, it's because there's not really any clear definition of what those things mean. So, yeah, I'm gonna kick it, but I just wanted to embrace everyone who might be like, why are they on the fence about this? So, yes, I have 3 male business partners, and I'm a co-beverage director with Patrick Corneau, and we were building the wine list for Ruffian months out, and we were actually focused in the southwest of France. We were like, we should make a list that's focused on the places that are kind of, I heard you have some stuff. And we're this tiny 20-seat bar in the East Village, and people were like, well, you won't be a good account for me necessarily money-wise, but as we started to be known for having a diverse offering, people said, well, I might not make a lot off of you, but I want to be on your wine list. So you get a little give and take. Did that answer it? I don't know. I went off like on a little tangent.
Yeah.
So I'm one of those regulars. I'm like, what haven't I had yet? And they do a really good job. But yeah, that's what I say. I'm like, you know what I like? Pour me something, pour me what I like. But they do a really good job of that, like knowing your audience, which is huge. So tell us about, like, I know you focus, well, tell me about the curation process a little bit more. Like, you have done some traveling. You do more traveling, I feel like, than Patrick does. Well, yeah, you don't have a kid. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? And especially because, like you said, you have really, especially in the beginning, you sought brands, wineries out that you wanted to work with. A bit about your travels.
Like most things, it's not as glamorous as it seems. All the tastings happen either at portfolio tastings or with mostly reps bringing, things for us to taste. It's only in the last year that, as we've grown, I've been able to travel a little bit more and take a deeper dive and see the wines in their natural habitat and meet the winemakers behind it. I've met a lot of the people at Ruffian or at Kindred, but now to actually be there in Slovenia or in the Republic of Georgia, it kind of ties it all together. It's like, I knew that on paper, but now I know it in life and in my heart. I know what you're doing. In terms of curating, for Ruffian, I think its success has been that we've just been flexible. If you saw our wine list when we opened to what it is now, they bear no reference to each other because we were able to just say, cool, my ego's not so deeply invested in this that I can't flex with what people want and make people happy. That's hospitality. If we had stuck with a vision and said, this is our restaurant and we won't budge from it, we would be out of business by now. And in terms of curation, that has allowed us to let everyone always wanted us to define Ruffian. Well, what are you? What kind of food is it? What kind of wine is it? Now, Ruffian I describe as a catch-all. It's like Ruffian is the place where we can try out every crazy idea for wine or for food. And then the other ventures that we do, like Kindred, help define Ruffian because Kindred is Adriatic, because we have a passion for the natural wines that are coming out of the Adriatic region from Italy, the islands, across Slovenia into Croatia. So it's that's a reference point, I guess, for Ruffian now. Yeah.
Can you just talk a bit about the way you've segmented the menu most recently at Ruffian? Because I love
Sure.
the way you do that. And it's it can speak to a lot of people.
Yeah, that actually happened really early on. So if you haven't been to Ruffian, which you should, at the very beginning, as I said, it has no reference to what it is now. The initial menu was segmented like most wine lists are by region. But then you have a bunch of, let's say, France and then subsection Burgundy, and then this lonely wine from Argentina, or this lonely wine from California, and it didn't make sense. And more importantly, what started to happen with a regional list for us was, well, this wine from Casablanca in Chile actually drinks more like a red Burgundy. So if people come in and let's assume that they know what they're talking about at Chilean wine, they might make this assumption that it's a really full-bodied, massive wine, and it's not. So then they're going to be disappointed. So where do we put these things so that people know how to purchase? You're already assuming a level of knowledge on the customer's part that they might not have. So our Burgundy portion started being filled more and more and more with wines that weren't from Burgundy. And then we were like, we just need to categorize these by things that are more evocative. So we have a brutal section. We have a section of like toothsome and autumnal and things that are just, they're not meant to be pithy or silly, but at least it gets a conversation started.
Tompkins Square Park and Central Park.
Yeah, for sparkling wines.
I love that.
Yeah, Tompkins Square Park and Central Park for the sparkling wines, right? It's like, champagne versus your pet nuts. So you might not know exactly what that means, but it means that you're probably going to ask me rather than look at 50 wines and go, I don't even know where to start with this list. Because you shouldn't. I'm there for that. That's my job. I don't know anything about investing and like banking, but I do know about wine. So why is the reverse not true?
Okay, last for you. You were written up in the New York Times about your women and wine tasting group last year or 2 years ago. Can you tell us about this group and why you started it and what you do and all of that good stuff?
So we get together on Monday mornings and we drink. Now, I started the group because I read an article in the Somme Journal, which is a trade publication, by Karen McNeil, who wrote the Wine Bible, and it was a really great article about just the state of women in the wine industry nationally. And one of the things that stuck with me was that she said women represent a very large portion of the service industry, but only up to a certain point in terms of going from like service to management, and that having children didn't account for that disparity. And that she kind of hinted at maybe that's because like you're not going for higher diplomas. And I thought, well, yeah, because wine tasting groups are really intimidating. I was terrified at the time, and I had already been a partner in Ruffian for 2 years at that point. And I started asking around and being, it's really easy to say, oh, we don't need this. There's a lot of women in the wine industry. But when you have every woman going, I would do that, I would totally come to that, then obviously there's a need for it and there was a desire for it. So it'll be 2 years in March. We've been meeting every other Monday, and it's unfortunately for industry only at this point. However, I started teaching classes at Kindred, so if anyone's interested, we can talk more about that. So we meet, we taste wine, and we feel it's like a different. And for those of you who don't know, a lot of the professional development and why these groups are important would be to go for like a diploma or a certificate in wine, which is largely male-dominated, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's a culture that can be quite aggressive and competitive. And I wanted to have a tasting group that didn't have that same feel, because if you're not necessarily pursuing one of those diplomas, you should still be able to be part of a tasting group and, not feel like well, I thought it was that, but I was afraid to say it.
So, I know we all want to get to tasting wine, so I'm going to wrap this up soon here. So just before we ask the final questions, Jenny from Jenny Francois, Mika from Wine for the World, and Francis each brought about 3 wines. So we have a total of like 9-ish, maybe more, some reserved bottles. We're going to open after this, and we have some more food coming out. It's going to be stationed. Impossible Burgers, plant-based. So we can all enjoy a little bit more food. But I want to ask just a couple questions. First, in a sentence, if you can give it a quick phrase, what does sustainability mean to you? A phrase, Jenny.
Sustainability, keeping our planet alive, basically. So I mean, for me, there's a lot of wineries that call themselves sustainable. I like to push further and work with wineries that are certified organic or biodynamic to have some, guidelines for what they're doing and understand what they're doing in terms of their spraying and stuff. But, sustainability is a start in terms of treating our planet well.
So I'd agree with that. I'd add that sustainability, a lot of what I look for is not only organic or biodynamic, also there's the concept, do no harm, but also to repair the world a little. So there's regenerative agriculture. There are these ideas that if you're going to be doing something with viticulture, that maybe you can make it a little bit better for the environment. One of our producers, for example, designates a large swath of their land for the preservation of biodiversity. Another one is located in a nature preserve. So, and it's been designated that way by the government. So, I think sustainability can take a lot of different avenues. I would just add that also I think financial sustainability is really important for the long-term success of sustainability for the environment, which is how we often talk about it. So I would just add that.
Thank you. Transparency for sure, and everything else that they said. But veganism is not just about not eating animals. It's about the environment, and that's one of the things that I look into winemakers is how you're going to make this world better. What are you doing to help fix the problem that we have now, that we all have right now? So even if we can't agree, for me, on veganism, we can agree on the environment, and that's what I look for.
Yes, and I'm also, I think of the panel, I'm the only one who's customer facing, and so for me it's about translating a huge cloud of information to a customer that is going to take away a soundbite in some sort of meaningful way. Because the information is so convoluted, and people just don't have the capacity, not that they don't have the capacity, the energy, time, or space to focus on this one thing. And so what can I impart that will actually stick with them and make a difference? And have an impact on their purchasing, whether in a restaurant or on the retail shelf.
And now I need to address the elephant in the room, which if you drink wine, if you follow wine, how are the tariffs currently impacting the threat of the tariffs, the tariff increase that has happened back in October during our busiest season of selling, October, November, December, OND. How has this impacted us thus far? Yet, I'd like to keep a positive spin on everything and focus on our potential as the rise of sustainability and female powerhouses in wine. So, hand it over to you.
That's a big task. To keep it light is a big task.
Keep it light. Talk about it.
So I wrote an op-ed in the Times a month ago, I guess. So there's a current threat of 100% tariff on all European wine, which obviously will affect many of us and our livelihoods. And it's about a conflict between Boeing and Airbus. And so the U.S. has been given permission to retaliate with tariffs. And so we're trying to, I've been to Washington a few times to talk to the United States trade representatives. I've learned a lot about our government and how it functions or doesn't function in the process. It's very interesting. But basically, we're trying to get wines carouseled off the tariffs and have them tariff something else. Because the way the wine industry works, it's a 3-tier system that's importer, distributor, retailer, restaurant. So it affects American business much more than it will affect Europe. And so because the point is to hurt European business, the way this, alcohol and wine import is a government mandated 3-tier system here, except for wine clubs that kind of bypass that. But traditionally, it's a very complex ever since Prohibition. So trying to take that off the table and so you can continue to enjoy European wines at the price they're at now.
So we started working with Spanish wines in September, and in October, the tariffs hit. So that was an interesting launch for us. That said, I think my company is a little bit, in some respects, maybe a little bit fortunate that we look to the obscure regions in a scenario like this because we have Brazilian wines which aren't affected, and South African wines, which a lot of folks are saying have an old world feel to them, and that's one of the I guess, if you will, the silver lining in a pretty dark situation. But I think what we were talking about before this event this evening started was that it's kind of forcing some of us to look to other regions a little bit faster, and maybe it's not a great thing because obviously a lot of businesses are going to be affected, and we're going to be affected. I'm going to be affected, but on the other hand, it's an opportunity as well for us to maybe learn and discover new things. Trying to put the positive spin on it.
Okay. Well, I import from Italy, France, and Chile. And when the whole tariff thing hit in October, I already did the importing from Italy and France. I was on Chile. So I haven't felt it like that yet. But one of the things that I look for is to have a solid relationship with the winemakers. And if I went out, I have to visit every vineyard and speak to every winemaker and know about them. And it's a bad situation because I'm going to keep working with them. Just have to figure out how. So just keeping hopes up high and learning as we go along.
Yeah, the good and bad of it is that, like in the case of Ruffian, as a restaurant buyer, we were already have an extremely diverse book. So we're not a French restaurant, right? So we're not like totally freaking out. But on the other hand, as you so nicely said, that we were sort of front runners in having a really diverse wine list, now we're facing competition because everyone else is going to be looking to the regions that we were already specializing in. So, yeah, I think there's just fear all around, and we're trying, I think, diversification and just coming up with plan Bs or what everyone else is doing, but it's a tough silver lining situation. I'm not going to sugarcoat it.